Yeah, so today this talk investigates the tragic software incidents and the cultural receptions and resilience through the K-pop cultures. And considering the political and social dispositions implicated in the collective trauma of the software incidents and its commemoration and the collective political effects may have transformed into a popular and metaphorical and symbolic representations in K-pop cultures. So through close textual analysis of K-pop music videos dealing with the software incidents, this try to map out the political and affective layers of K-pop as a critical space. So software incidents that happened in April 16, 2014, killing more than 300 people, mostly high school students, gave highly indelible social cultural trauma to Korean society. So before talking about these trajectories of software incidents and the K-pop reactions to it, I'd like to address some analogical questions both as a Korean citizen and a human being to witness these traumatic tragedies. So in the beginning of the Spectres of Nox, Derrida's one of my favorite writings, the very last writings on the connections between the death of communism and the fate of Marxism, he interrogates these questions. If someone comes forward and says, "I'd like to learn to live finally," and then this meaning of finally continuously lingering in my mind, and what is this meaning of finally? What is this meaning of living and learning to live? So if I can change and appropriate the meaning of life and death in relation to these tragic software incidents, perhaps my question would be, who can learn to live, and from whom? And will we ever know how to live properly from this trauma? And more importantly, what does the meaning of learn to live? And simply saying, to live is not just something one can learn, or not from oneself automatically, not learn from life or taught by life. To live is something that one only learns from the others and from death. So internally and externally, this might be a heterodidactics between life and death. So in this talk, I'd like to address the meaning of living in contemporary Korea after the software incidents and the post-memory in the work of popular cultural forms. The very meaning that a lot of people think it as being in an opposite spectrum of the discourses, perhaps. So as a media historian and culture studies scholar, I'd like to dedicate myself to teach and transcend this specific meaning of sovereignty under the Park Geun-hye regimes on how to not forget as a technology of living behind this death in contemporary Korean society. So it is very difficult to say the meaning of contemporaneity after the failure of regime changes back in 2012. The social moods and the lethargy of the everyday life has been overshadowed in neoliberal South Korean societies. And then these incidents happened. So the software disaster that happened in April 16, 2014. Mostly high school students on the school trips on their way to Jeju Island is seen as a disaster that resulted from the combination of the government's lack of effort, eluding responsibility, and mishandling of a very preventable disaster. The disaster created an outrage in South Korea and created a demand for special investigative law of the disaster to reveal and bring to justice parties that are responsible for the sequence that led to drowning of the ferry itself. So this demand, however, was met with another disappointing responses from the government, as it was misrepresented and misportrayed in the effort to shift the blames to even the family of the victims and to suppress the protest in 1914 until now. So in this meaning, in April 16, 2014, the concept of modernity in South Korea has stopped, as what this mother said. So what is the meaning of contemporaneity in this context as a group of collective people who share this specific trauma in the post-software incidents in South Korea? The protest of the citizens took the very visible form of hunger strikes by the family of the victims, alongside the movements by the Korean abroad, mostly mothers, not only to raise the funds for the victim families, but also the awareness of these callous reactions to the government regarding this disaster. So nevertheless, even after 2 years have passed, the pain and the trauma of the disaster do not seem to have gone completely away, and still continue to linger in the collective memory and consciousness. This is actual footages of unpublished video clips from the remnant of the victim's smartphone. The circulations of the video especially gave the collective anxiety and trauma of the Koreans that the students, as a Korean citizens, cannot be protected by the government, which resulted in the indelible feeling of insecurity and mass trauma among Korean peoples. So these images left us with a very poignant last moment of celebrity right before the ship is sinking into the abyss. The weight of the disaster and the heavy lingering after effect in the society and its consciousness have been the subject of various observations of Korean scholars and many other art movements and the media cultures as well. The Seoul disaster has created a pervasive sense of empathy of the suffering and anger directed to the government, strong enough to create a moment that is very much pivotal to democracy, where emotions in fact come to the forefront as a source of ideas for the awakening of strong sensibility and strong solidarity to question the role of government and the meaning of governmentality. The Seoul incident was the signpost for most of the Koreans to rethink about the meaning of contemporary and the meaning of contemporaneity and the modernity itself in everyday life that they took for granted for a long time. The search for the truth, the search for the lost track of time is always concluded as a search for a truth. But then, this specific truth is not to be found by affinity, nor by goodwill, but betrayed by involuntary signs, many other public cultural signs. There are signs that force us to conceive this specific lost time and space. So this disjointed time of losing children was a passage of excruciating time for all of us to endure. It is also the annihilation of what was human beings and the alteration of what it means to be a human being. I'm also reminded of some of the seminal questions posted by Judith Butler's in Precarious Life, actually, a collection of essays written in response to the war in Iraq. She draws on the Ottoman's notions of bare life, asking us to consider who counts as human, whose life counts as lives, and finally, what makes for a grievable life. Although coming out of a different context, Seoul incidents and its cultural imaginations in K-pop may ask us to look at these questions in relation to the historical and political context of Korea. Perhaps that's why the popular media culture is a revelation to see and show us again about the Seoul incidents with images and personals and family memories as a post-memory. I will discuss these metaphors, materials, and media K-pop artists have used to explore the personal and family memories that constitute imaginative interventions in the larger public sphere of Korean societies. To interpret these fragments of unknown narratives, wholesome memories, and conflicting versions of the history as K-pop revisits and renew the past, the traumatic past. So for their unknown faces like this, they're no longer existing faces that are continuously reborn in a pure state that signals absences and losses. I will try to rebuild, reconnect, and bring back to life to these unknown victims in the popular narrative of K-pop poiesis analysis. So the sign of the affection, the lingering of the past and present, the appearing to the surface, the moment of vivacity in life and the subsequent disappearing into the abyss. These hold like tragic signs that gave us the pain of witnessing and constituting the signs of the time lost forever. The moment of cultural interpretations in relation to Seoul incidents show us the involuntary recollections and ambivalence that sometimes take the sharp turns to pain instead of continuing in reminiscence. It is suffice to say that the present sensation sets its materiality of culture and gives a sense of irreparable loss as a present sensation, the strange contradictions of survival and of nothingness. So we must experience these specific violent effects of the signs, and then the mind must be forced to seek the signs' meaning itself. So the various music videos about the Seoul incidents, the ideas of memory and trauma, appear in several signs, such as desires, imaginations of life and death, as a departure and ending, lost in disjointed time and space, repressions and reappearances, absences and losses. the discovery of this kind of science by the audiences and consumer of the K-pop, whether it is voluntary or not, gives the meaning to science that remains significant in effective comprehension of our repetitive trauma and memory that will perpetuate as a cultural mirror of contemporary society. So we need to think about the importance of a multitude of struggles between various groups that were involved and surfaced in the aftermath of the cell-fire incidents that include the struggles between dominant and subordinate groups and between various class sectors vying for control in the society. In South Korean circumstances, the liberals and conservative hegemony groups struggled around the issues of the truth of cell-firing. And the same struggles also happen between the wide ranges of the dominant and subordinate groups in online and offline communities. On the one hand, this struggle of ideology surrounding the cell-fire incidents and the meaning of the basic rights to life under the Park Geun-hye regimes mobilize the sentiments, affections, and belief to induce consent centered upon certain dominant core assumptions about social life, such as the freedom of speech, value of individualism, and family, and so on. These are core assumptions or so-called common sense of the societies are deployed by the government, whereby groups, politics, forces within the struggle tend to deploy the discourses of democracy, freedom, and rights to life, which they inflect according to their own ideological agendas and purposes. Just like this, they just like blaming the victims by the government. And some of the ultra-right-wing criminalities kind of like made during these times, like through the Ilbe communities. So the Butlers points to ways in which this specific official media and historical narrative in relation to the post 9/11 in the US have been used to achieve the hegemonic consensus to control the ways in which people to see, how they hear, what they see. So here, however, the popular imaginations through the K-pop, interpretations among the audiences, and they refigure the official things that they have not been admissible, as well as to attempt to see beyond the boundaries of circumscribed or hegemonic public spheres that have hidden or forgotten or ungrievable lives. The sulfur incidents triggered by perpetuating mournings and trauma of the tragedy is positioning us as a collective witness of the death on nationwide televisions. This positionality as witnesses has created and imposed upon us the chemical synthesis of indelible memories and unconscious of this guilty as those who survives. Then how have the popular imagery and its representation produced and remembered the discourses of celebrated incidents, and how has it borne a specific politics of the urgencies and making inclusions and exclusions, and subsequently become a certain form of revelations in the contemporaneity in South Korea? Perhaps we have to look at the media cultures as well as political discourses on cell-fire incidents that helps establishing the hegemony of specific cultural resilience and commemorations. The K-pop cultures produces representation that attempts to induce consent to certain political positions and getting members of the society to see a specific moments that had been concealed, censored, and normalized by the government. Therefore, I'd like to argue the symbolic forms of media culture contains discourses and figures, concepts and images, and political positions with symbolic forms in K-pop music videos from 1914 to 1916. So, in 1914, the Korean popular singer Yun Sang, if you want to console me, so like he actually proposed this like juxtapositions in between the survivors as spectators and then victimized. And then being the spectators of the calamities taking places in cell-fire incidents is kind of like quintessential modern experiences for Koreans who went through the two consecutive conservative political atmospheres. So during the time, the news framing right after the incidents happened, they're continuously trying to media framing about like we need to overcome this sorrow and the angerness, and then they even like misreport about these issues that like most of the 338 Danan High School students are all survived, and even like Park Geun-hye herself, the President Park Geun-hye herself is actually talking that saying that by close investigations we need to ask who is responsible for these tragic events. So which means that even like government is not even like responsible for this specific tragedy. So this tragedy and its media coverage during the incidents became uncanny spectacles, running through the venerable guidelines of the news and 24 hours, headline news shows to which the response is compassion or indignations or titillations as each misery heaves into views. So in that era, in 2014, the main other question is how to respond to and dealing with the increasing flow of information about these agonies of cell-therapy is also a kind of like a really important issues during the 1914 media coverages. And perhaps this music video is the first reverberations, cultural reverberations in relation to these spectatorships and victimized. So this song itself is actually showing the specific spectacles of others and how to deal with these specific pains of the others as the spectators and as the survivors. So in this music video, you may recognize this actress, Yoon Jin-sung. She's a very familiar actress in Old Boys in Bakchang Park. So right before she actually jumped into the rivers, she committed suicide. She actually taken photos and saying, please remember. So the Yoon Sung's music videos, in the second verse, he actually talking about the really the direct criticisms to the authority, to the governments. Someone who had everything has too much to lose. The sadness of losing world, which is the victims' families, is nothing significant to them. Them is the authority or the government. So this specific monologue in the beginning of the second verse of the songs infiltrates the primal guilty of the survivors and or the audiences who are witnessing the entire tragedy incidents on the screen, on the nationwide televisions. So perhaps we have to think about these notions of Dominic Lacapra's historical traumas, that he appropriated this concept of loss has potential to be shown as a certain discourses on self-aware incidents. For example, these ideas of loss is actually like, we can think about the death of lovers or memories of the Holocaust, or this kind of like a mass massacre of the self-aware incidents. So Lacapra actually proposed that to overcome this historical trauma, we need a time to proper mourning process and then commemorate the traumatic events properly. So think about 2014, right after the celebratory incidents were happening, and the people, the media coverage, and the government continuously talking that like we need to overcome, we need to overcome. We don't have a proper moment of a mourning process at that times. And then perhaps this song itself is actually talking and reverberating about this proper moment of commemorations and time to mourn the loss. As you may see in the verse that I just like highlight in here, please leave me alone. I lost the whole world just now. And then please leave me, let me be crying. And if you want to really console me. So this song is actually talking about the specific moment of commemorations and mourning the specific times to recuperate from the loss and trauma. And in 2015, there has after the 1 year commemorations of the celebratory, there is two music videos. The first one is Arc the Light, and then Kim Sung-gu, one of the boy bands groups, the Infinite, he released the single albums. So at this time, the K-pop deals with the tragedy in a very personal way, reverberating around the themes of love and yearning for familiar reunifications, from mother to daughters, or the star to a fan. So this music video is very simple narratives. The arc lights centers on the nuclear family of a single mother and a daughter who have very close relationship with each other, but with no indication of father figures in here. And the daughter died in an accident, and the mother tried to cope with this specific grief by revisiting the happy memory with the daughter. The symbolism used in these music videos about the self-aware incidents is very much straightforward, because this bus was spurred heavily, but the girl seems very unconscious about these shakes, and then keep playing together and joke with each other, as you may see in this the actual video clips. So this specific like juxtapositions hauntingly echo the images of circulating of this video taken by the students in the final moments. And then there are another sequence that like very much resemble the ways the cell-affair incidents were depicted in the media, such as all the tables where the mother puts on the food and brings the daughter light. And then the most striking fact in this music video is that there is a moment when all sound is controlled, and ironically, this cheerful music suddenly stops when the mother is confronted with this tragic news. And then she remembered the very last moment of her daughter. This is kind of like a primer images that was repetitively used throughout the music videos. And the typical sound control technique in the music video amplifies the melodramatic effect in the sequence, but the listening is, if we think that listening is an active process in times and space that moves and resounds and reverberates, and the subjects it constitutes in movements and agitation, even in silence. Therefore, this kind of like void of sound, the time when the mother is confronted with her daughter in a fantasy, the silence is not just an absence of sound, but of the essence and the body of the subjects is its origin and endpoint. And perhaps another striking features of this music video is the absence of father figures, which is very much prevalent figures in Gwangwon area through the hunger strikes. According to Hannah Arendt, in her concept of facultative promises, the control over the future is successful due to a particular kind of memory. For Arendt, the facultative promises is essentially a facultative memory that has the power to bring a body of people back to their beginning. In this sense, the promise and hope of grieving families represented by the father figures is a reminder that keeps the bonding the group intact and link the individual back to a past from which it began and from which it can begin again. So this is why Arendt, the promise is not applied to an action from the outside, but that it is in itself an articulation of natality or rebirth from the traumatic past. So in doing so, this specific promise reverses the flow of time. Therefore, instead of being born into an uncertain future, one is born into a secure past. So promises of mourning, either in the media coverage or in reality, is associated with the female maternal figures. So in this diegetic time and space in the light music videos, all father figures are performing their own facultative promises through hunger strikes that evokes the memory of ideal past, the time when their children were still alive and healthy, when only maternal figures shapes in this music video the moral framework of soothing the scars and trauma of the past. And then meanwhile, this is another music video that I just talked about, and then which is closely related to the symbolic tribute for these infinite fans, the Hansei and one of the victims in the Seoul Ferry incidents. The overarching narrative of these songs is very straightforward, the separations of the brothers and sisters, and they hope for his sister would return safely. And the interesting thing is during the time, the censorship, the governmental censorship is so strong. So like the cultural representation of this specific popular musics reverberating and like the representation of celebratory incidents was strictly prohibited in public media forms. So even the entertainment companies and then the singer himself did not acknowledge that the music video was made with the intention of commemorating the incidents directly. But interestingly, the Infinite has a global fandom. So a lot of global fandom actually recognize the Seoul Ferry incidents through these music videos. So in the beginning of the music video, there is a fishbowl with a sinking female doll with a diver. There's so many like interesting symbols and signs in these music videos. And when you closely look at the ball, there is a yellow ribbons in here. And strong sentiments throughout the music video echo the mourning and commemoration of victims with the hidden yellow ribbons. And the music video itself is actually appropriates the symbolic sequences of flowing waters, dimming lights on the dark surface, such as like reminiscent of the cabin, and the symbols that reminiscent of the rescue efforts in this failure. And then the protagonist enters the room where the female uniforms hangs in the wall beside the yellow flowers. And in this empty room of the missing girls, there is a lot of kind of wishful thinking is actually posted on the wall. The clothes I want to wear, the things I want to have, the place I want to go. This is clearly juxtaposed with the actual room of the cell-ferry victims. All these unfulfilled desires on the walls are reminiscent of the room of one of the cell-ferry victims, the Han Seong. She was also a fervent fan of the boy band Infinite. So back into the music video analysis. So the singer in the next sequence is now holding the fishbowl as if he's preserving all of the girls' unfulfilled wishes. And it's also indications of the Jindo Inn, the wandering around the Jindo areas in here, in these specific music videos. As you may know, the Jindo is the closest port where the incidents happen and the place where most of the victims' family desperately waiting for their sons and daughters to come back. So all of these kind of music videos during the 1915, 1 year after the cell-ferry incidents, they're actually making a specific personal memories into the popular imagination cultural forms. And the last music video that I'm going to provide here is very interesting things that this year, it was released this year, One of These Nights, cheerleaded by the Red Velvet from SM Entertainment. It was actually like showing the perspectives from the ghost. So perhaps this might be the reason this music video, the whole 5 members of the Red Velvet look so indifferent, so mechanically soulless now in the music videos. And some of the teasers images in here, there are 5 girls sitting around in a circle wearing white robes, and only one girl in the left side, the youngest one, 18 years old, was blurred in the cover as an indication of the death of same-aged high school girls who became victims in the cell-ferry. So there is a remnant of victims of cell-ferry as an archive seems to present a sort of counterweight to the differentiality of the symbolized and its realities. I'll just skip the lyric part. And this is the first K-pop music videos that reverberates with cell-ferry incidents through the gaze of the victims and the deceased from the ghost perspectives. The prevalent images and symbols in the music videos, like yellow papers, boats, or the ribbons, are frequently represented. And the narrative of the song itself is actually saturated a subtle meaning of the Korean mythological storylines from the Korean folktales, the children. Yes. So I'll just just show you why this music video is actually showing a specific cultural representations of the cell-ferry incidents and its specific traumatic events, memorializations as opposed to memories. So this music video, as you may see, the girls are standing in the oblique corridors under the flickering lights, which is reminiscent of the cabins of the cell-ferries. And the youngest girl is actually spying on the other side of the keyhole, which she's trying to witness the truth. And her gaze as a peeping Tom to camera symbolizes a time when she realized the truth and tries to escape, but realized it was too late because it was already blocked by the waters. So this kind of whole cultural representation and symbolic meaning is actually embedded within the music videos. This is very sequence also indicates that all students could have survived. And this is another kind of passive characters symbolized in this music video, Iron. She symbolizes the victims who are obedient to the instructions of the elders and sat still in the cabin as asked by the announcement from ship crews. So I'll just skip this whole part. Alright. So the music, this is the ending sequences. The video closes with the 5 girls sitting in the circle with the candles, staring up to the audience, up to the survivors, as if their existence is not toward death, but toward living on a presence as a perpetual traces of life and death in this music video that would identify them as a living presence. So far, we saw some of the popular imaginations and cultural facts as a sign, and it keeps us to rethink about the traumatic events in personal and social and spectral